Marty, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very honored to be here as we prepare to celebrate Veterans Day. My book, Finding My Father's Footsteps, as a friend and colleague historian said, is part history, part mystery, and part travelogue. But I hope what you're going to find is something else that I bring to the story, and that's my background in historic preservation. My specific interest in the landscape, the built landscape, and what it can reveal about our lives, about individual lives. I'm going to pause right here because a friend just walked in and he threw me off my. Thanks, Jake. I want to give you an example. So most of you saw this picture that Harkin distributed with the, the flyer on the top. And my father wrote about the encampment at Plymouth. Can everybody see? Can everybody read the captions? Because I'm not going to take time to read them if that's okay. Are they all legible, or would you like me to?
Yeah.
Okay. He wrote about their encampment at Plymouth just before they deployed for D-Day, but he didn't mention that there was anything unusual about their surroundings. So imagine my surprise when I discovered that this is what Plymouth looked like, the Port of Plymouth.
Oh.
I think that it helps give you a context for the previous picture. And that's the idea, thus the title of my book. The idea of walking in the landscape of someone's life to try to see what it can reveal. So I have to admit that the longer I spent in my dad's footsteps, they became one with the thousands of soldier footsteps all around him. With this in mind, I'd like to ask a few questions. So, and I want to honor, before I say how many of you are veterans, I want you all to realize Frank Hartzell with the 11th Armored Division, World War II veteran, is sitting right up front with us. Do I have any other veterans in the group? And Victoria, his granddaughter, is a graduate of Harkham, and she brought him here. So I think this is your story is better than the one I have. And I think most of us are baby boomers. So I just want to see a show of hands. How many of you had dads who served in World War II? Any moms? Uncles? Relatives? Okay. So almost everyone here had somebody who served in World War II. And of all those people, how many of them spoke to you at any length about their service? Okay, you're lucky. A few of you did. So I wrote my book because of the silence that I had from my own father. I hope that his experience and his colleagues will remind you of the men and women that served in your families. And I want to note that my subject was the 4th Infantry Division during World War II in Europe, so I will not be as familiar with many of the places that some of your family members may have served. So to begin, this year we are honoring the 80th anniversary of D-Day, which occurred on June 6, 1944. Next year we will recognize the anniversary of the E-Day in Europe, which happened on May 8, 1945, and finally for the world on September 2nd, 1945. I began my book with the following observation about that war. Excuse me. My father, John Fletcher Sisson, had 4 war stories he told, and his children were chuckling at the end of each one. They were all in reference to World War II, the largest war in the history of humanity, when 50 to 75 million people, about 3% of the world's population, perished. This does not count lives lost, this does not count lives ruined, just lost. A war that tore nations and families apart and ended with the atomic bomb, the most devastating instrument of destruction yet devised. The war that would define the modern world, the world we live in today. The thought that light-hearted stories about such a war might be inappropriate never crossed my mind growing up. When it finally did, I discovered that most of my contemporaries found themselves in the same situation. Although all of our parents were impacted by the worldwide conflict, the great majority of them never spoke about it unless casually, like my dad. And so, now if you all will, let's travel back in time to 353 Gill Avenue in Galion, Ohio. It's January 1945. A young lieutenant puts a piece of paper in a typewriter in his room and begins to type. He adjusts his wire-rimmed glasses and shrugs. This is Saturday night, the 6th of January, 1945. The typewriter keys hit the paper. He has a lot to consider. The Nazi bullet that almost took his life just 6 months ago is still lodged in his abdomen, where the fatty tissue has begun to buffer it. He was hit 4 days after landing on D-Day with the 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division at Utah Beach in Normandy. He is considered fully recovered, having been sent back to the front in December of 1944. He might be typing because the bullet wound in his right hand is still healing. He was shot again in November, 2 days into his regiment's fight in the Hurtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest and most disastrous battlefields of the war. He is just one of tens of thousands of young men called to duty by country, although he is older than most. They are 19 to 22. He is 27. Just 6 years earlier, his fraternity brother had written words that came all too true when Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and World War II officially began. After listening to the latest report from abroad concerning the international situation, I hold out no hope that war can be averted. It's like watching a great tide approach, bringing in chaos. I hope I'm strong. The top map shows the disastrous advance of the totalitarian Axis powers by 1941, before the American entry into the war. Excuse me. In December of that year, after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor and the German and Italian declaration of war on America. By 1942, you can see that some of the Axis territory has been reclaimed, but they are still incredibly powerful. It had seemed the war might be lost before the young man would be called to fight, but on June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious landing in the history of warfare took place when 155,000 infantry soldiers and paratroopers were dispatched from England to secure a foothold on an occupied continent. This map gives you a perspective of the terrible odds they faced. Note the 5 tiny red lines coming from England. Excuse me. The 5 little lines, and that the tiny, tiny dot on Normandy in northern France. Those are our boys turned men in a few minutes that day that they simply called D-Day. This is an excerpt from what that young lieutenant had to say about that morning. We could see Omaha Beach off to our left, our own Utah Beach dead ahead. Battleships were sending up great flashes of smoke and flame as they threw their shells shoreward. Rocket boats disappeared in a cloud of smoke as they discharged their deck full of rocket launchers. Suddenly, there were no more questions. Only a GI saying, "Those bastards are trying to kill us sure as hell." That is all that is needed to make a soldier fight. That is what makes him do brave things or cowardly things. Just that one phrase. Despite all he had seen and done, the young man had been quickly adjusting to civilian life. Although I'm sure he and his buddies had plenty of laughs over the handout you're all holding, I hope you all had a chance before the lecture to take a look at this important advice to returning soldiers. This one's my favorite. In traveling in the U.S., it is often necessary to spend the night in a hotel. Here, for a small sum, one can register and be shown to a room where he can sleep for the night. The present practice of entering the nearest house, throwing the occupants in the yard, and taking over the premise will cease. That young man became my father. I have no idea where that list of do's and don'ts came from, but they were actually in with his official records. I guess soldier humor that was all too true. And that manuscript, it got completed, as Marky said, all 70 pages that described his service from 1943 until December of 1944. And then it sat in his files for 45 years, never to be discussed with his family or even my mother never saw it until 2 days after he died at the age of 74, when I discovered it going through his files for the bankers who had come to speak to my grieving mother. It was there with scrapbooks of pictures when he returned to the fight in Europe in March of 1945. And it was there with letters home and pictures, and then a heartfelt description that he'd written to his staff sergeant when he himself returned to Normandy in 1979 to retrace his footsteps. And in that letter, he described some of the conflict that he had faced with his platoon. Again, nothing in that file had ever been shared with my family. I felt like I was meeting a man I'd never met before. Why, I asked myself, if you play a role in history, don't you talk about it? Well, he actually did, sort of. One of the stories my father told concerned a faded red book that was always shelved at random in our home. This is all he had to say about it. I was the officer in charge of securing Heinrich Himmler's home at the end of the war. There was a large gold embossed Mein Kampf on a pedestal next to his desk. It was too large for my pack, so I took the smaller volume from his desk. When I got back to headquarters, I realized it could go home with my commanding officer or with me. I decided to keep it. The book was an artifact from the war, booty. It was a copy of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, annotated by Heinrich Himmler. Dad kept a thin paperback next to the book, simply entitled Himmler. The front cover featured a weasel of a person. On the back cover, written in large black letters, it said, Hitler was surrounded by sycophants and toadies, men who competed for shares in the spoils of power. Göring, Goebbels, and Heinrich Himmler stood out among this new German aristocracy. And of the three, Heinrich Himmler, the obsessive gatherer and filer of information, was the one who eventually came to yield most real power. As head of the Gestapo and the concentration camps, it was he who organized the extermination of more than 10 million people. A faded red book. As a historic preservationist, I've handled many documents, letters. I don't deal with artifacts very often. I do know that houses and places that we live can tell many stories about the people who live within the walls, the people who built them. But what could a book, what could a faded red book say to me, or to my father who had taken it? 10 million innocent people murdered. The first three sections of the book introduce the mystery surrounding the Mein Kampf, the man who brought it home, my dad, and the family that ignored his war booty until forced to reckon with something we had never taken time to consider. Unbeknownst to anybody in the family, the Mein Kampf was published in 2 volumes. We only had volume 1, and therein lies the mystery in the story. The family that owned volume 2 accused my father of lying about how he had obtained volume 1. They also introduced the theme for the majority of the story, how to penetrate the silence of those who serve. Throughout the book, I sought to resolve this question. How are civilians supposed to learn about war and the consequences of it when the people close to them don't speak about it? I was seeking to understand real war, not the television war or the movie war we see, or even the book war we read about. The following quote that you're reading on the screen finally helped guide me. It was from the life reporter who landed with the 4th Infantry Division on D-Day and wrote about it just 2 months later. I realized I had been confused and distracted by the politics and strategies of war. I wanted to know the human factor. I wanted to learn about the soldiers' war from the men who had served. I had never really before considered what it took for ordinary men and women who raised my generation to confront and liberate vast expanses of the world. No one talked about it at home, and they barely taught about us. They barely taught us about it in high school. I had never equated my dad or my friends' fathers with the young men who landed in an occupied continent and then fought unabated for 11 months against a war-hardened, totalitarian military force that had conquered it. The soldiers I read about were always somebody else, not the person that I ate dinner with or who had smiled at my first footsteps. And I never thought about what some of these dads and grandfathers had seen and done. For example, some of the men liberated the concentration camps. They weren't warned and they weren't prepared for what they found. Many fought a brutal war and had to face their own mortality and the tragic deaths and disfigurements of countless comrades. I had also never considered what it took for the civilians of Europe to find resolution and a path forward to life after experiencing the mayhem and tragedy that they experienced, and there were millions of them growing up. The final section of the book traces my journey with these men and with myself. I wanted to listen what they had to say about the soldiers' war, and through them, get a glimpse of what civilians endured. And here I found that most of my previous paradigms about war had been simplistic at best and perhaps even dangerous at worst. One example. After the D-Day landing, it took a week for the 4th Infantry to achieve its initial objective of securing the Quinville Ridge, crucial high ground in the advance to the critical port of Cherbourg. As you can see on the map, you can see it's about 20 miles, it's 31 miles from Utah Beach to Cherbourg, and the high ground of Quinville Ridge is just about in the middle. The town of Montaberg was key to this operation and had been under a bombing siege by the Allies before the Germans abandoned the city. James Drennan, who served with a field artillery battalion attached to the 4th, wrote the following. Walking into the city of Montaberg on or about June 14, 1944, I felt complete sadness imprinted on my mind. Dead mothers and fathers holding their dead children was a scene I was not ready to handle. Dead men from D-Day to the Battle of the Bulge have all faded from my mind, but not the scene in the train or bus station. God, please forgive us. These were the French citizens he had come to protect and liberate. So how actually to accomplish my goal of understanding the soldiers' war? I made 2 decisions. First, publishing my dad's first-person account, written within the 7 months of the landing, was my first objective. As you all are probably aware, diaries are incredibly important to research because they don't offer the value of hindsight. They usually offer first thoughts. So here you have an example of my father's thoughts on war-torn England. My second decision was to record my process in hopes that civilians like myself could use the book almost as a blueprint. Is this legible anymore with the light? I'm sorry.
Someone stood there.
Yeah. Blocked it just
We need
enough.
somebody to sit here.
Matt, I think it was Matt. Matt, keep moving.
No, he needs to stand. Maybe the flag.
I think Matt shielded it.
From upstairs.
Oh.
Yeah, he's blocking it, he moved.
I'm sorry. Let's see. I had wrote the book to serve almost as a blueprint for other people to uncover their family stories as I had. To accomplish this, I rolled up my sleeves and took a crash course in World War II history and Army organization for a woefully unprepared civilian. A stylistic decision was made to use a typewriter font, so the reader would always know when my father was speaking as opposed to me. And then I added a glossary of slang and terms to the back of the book, and as far as I'm concerned, the first thing everyone needs to know if they're going to try to follow the Army is how it's organized, which I have up here. War is teamwork, I learned, and you need to know how the teams are organized if you're going to understand your role, the role your loved one is playing. So these are the key abbreviations and units for the Army. Within the division and regiment, what I learned is that you have to be able to get down to at least the battalion, because now you're only dealing with about 1,000 men if you're trying to find what your loved one was doing. And then maybe if you're really lucky, you might be able to sort through a company and then get down to the platoon, which I was able to do. So now I'm able to trace my father and his 45 men. Next are the maps. Always back to the landscape. I had learned after 10 years of researching the Battle of Brandywine in Chester County, which occurred on September 11, 1777, that landscape seldom misleads you. I can't tell you how many folklore tales we were able to correct by finding the correct road, the correct observation point, the correct river crossing within the battlefields, and any veteran here will tell you how important terrain is to all military operations. So I got my friend Ann Bedrick, who's an illustrator, to map my journey so I could see the towns the men were confronting and their objectives as they lay up ahead of them. When I needed, I could do an overlay of rivers, forests, and high ground, so I could see where they were physically existed within the context of all the fighting going on around them, which is one thing about the book that I don't want to be misleading. I'm just following the 22nd Infantry. There's lots going on that I'm not having. I thought everybody here could relate to the Battle of the Bulge. So the 22nd Infantry, 22nd Infantry is down here holding the front line. So the line had sort of come along following the border of Germany. And what the incursion, the Bulge, probably you all know this, I didn't when I started, the Bulge is simply our front line crumbling and falling back to where, you know, the famous story of the 101st Airborne finally stood their ground at Bastogne. So you've got the 22nd down here bravely holding this point on the river, which is very important because Patton came up through that hole and he was able to, and his troops are able to subsequently stop the German forces. Finally, I completed my dad's section. Here you will find all kinds of soldier pranks and misdeeds, descriptions of training in the United States and England, girl chasing, a nice description of Eisenhower and Montgomery, who are pictured here addressing the troops, a paragraph of each man in his platoon, nightclubs in Liège. You're all waiting for combat, right? Yeah, right? And French resistance fighters. Oh, and yes, a very few pages devoted to combat and nothing about his Purple Hearts. So, wanting to learn more, in 2019, I had the opportunity to travel to Normandy with my daughter to actually walk in his footsteps. And this time, I was armed with the personal correspondence that he had shared with his staff sergeant and the pictures he took when he was there in 1979. This gave me an entirely new appreciation of the bravery of the young men he served with and the impossibility of waging war in Normandy. You'll notice the hedgerows. They were perfect to defend, impossible to penetrate. Catherine and I traced the 4 days my father safely led his platoon of 45 men. And then we came to the chateau where it all ended. The chateau that is pictured on the cover of the book and photographed here in 1979 by my dad in the lower left-hand corner. The X on my dad's map he used when he returned to Normandy marks the picture he took in the upper right-hand corner. The green area is the chateau grounds where the battle took place, and the yellow line is the movement of his battalion. Out of the 240 soldiers of F Company we landed with on D-Day, his commander, Captain Fulton, was killed in the battle that took place here. Only 1/3 of Fulton's men would remain on the field that evening. My father and Al Meade, the man who saved his life the night of D-Day, were among those seriously wounded. My father personally tried to save the lives of 2 of his men. He did not know the full extent of his platoon's casualties. As I read my father's words to you, Catherine and I are standing facing the chateau shown in the lower left-hand corner. The German position is to our right in the woods, and just behind us is the same ivy-covered stone wall and pillar shown in the picture, the high-water mark of the attack. This somber spot brought back vividly that Ozzy Wurzburger's squad had taken a German anti-tank gun with its crew just behind the ivy-covered pillar. Ozzy was lying in the grass just in front of the wall. Ralph Carter was wounded, lying across the wall under the trees. Jenkins and I dressed his wound at the chateau, and Jenkins stayed by his side for over an hour. We couldn't get litter bearers up for either him or Wurzburger. I recall trying to get Lieutenant Camper to set up a light machine gun at the corner of the wall. The crowds were dropping mortar and light arms fire into the trees. I was hit while trying to move up along the edge of the trees in the open field behind the pillar. Standing here, my daughter in tears, forever changed my life. I felt witness to the cost and courage of service to country. I would never again wonder why my father's 1945 narrative paid homage to the medics who saved his life and to the men of his platoon instead of discussing combat details. You are reading what he had to say about one of his men who died at the chateau. I would no longer wonder why my father is silent about war. My final walk in my father's footsteps was to resolve the question of honor. To do this, I had to place him in Heinrich Himmler's home in southern Bavaria near the end of the war. Inspired by the everyday cost and heroism of the soldiers' war, I decided to follow the entire 22nd Infantry on their long fight through Europe to see if I could place him there. To do this, I condensed the daily action reports for the 4th Infantry Division's 22nd Infantry Regiment into weeks, and then I brought that action to life through the deeds and stories of men who were fighting. I had about 20 soldiers that I followed. This slide in your handout shows the master maps of the march, which is the dark-colored area from Utah Beach to their final destination on May 8th of Diggelsbühl, Germany. The 11-month fight that I detailed extended over 1,600 miles, 199 days with no rest. The advance cost the 4th Infantry Division 34,000 total casualties. I'd like to let a few of the men that I followed tell you what they thought about that moment they had fought so long and hard for. They're pictured here. May 8th, 1945, the E-Day. Major Swede Henley. They announced it. Ruggles got over the crud. Tommy Harrison stopped stuttering. George Goforth lost all ailments, and the psycho said he was normal. Swede was laughing as he was never hit. Poor shots, the dirty bastards. Lieutenant Sisson. Frankly, all the peace news seems more or less of an anticlimax. So if I'm not enthusiastic enough about it, don't let it worry you. In the meantime, don't let this VE business get you down, but you may open a bottle of beer for me. And finally, Chaplain Boyce. There was no revelry last night, no drunkenness, no shouting, no flag waving, no horn blowing. There was a sober realization that it was all over, at least so far as Europe was concerned. We simply thought of the hundreds and hundreds of our friends who had given everything they had in order that we might see the E-Day. What had a faded red book played in that mayhem and tragedy? And what in turn had it taught me about the question I asked myself and all of you? What does honor, country, and service mean to those of us who have not put our lives on the line to protect civilian, family, and community. And what does it mean to those who have? I've learned that World War II isn't a war lurking in the distant past. Neither is Vietnam and the subsequent wars on terror. They're here and present. There's a hero in my neighborhood. There's a family gravesite that needs a flag. There's someone whose name needs to be said out loud. I've discovered I don't have to wait until somebody puts on the Memorial Day parade. There are plenty of veterans organizations that could use my support. I've been more than welcome to the 22nd Infantry Regiment Society reunions pictured here. And I was an anti-war demonstrator. Those guys are they're pretty generous. I've discovered a wide array of educational events I can support and to attend. These guys pictured are one of my favorite. They're the 4th Infantry Division educational reenactors. And believe it or not, there's a similar organization in France. There's guys from France and Belgium who are also World War II American reenactors. They're wonderful. It's my hope, as I mentioned, that my book will encourage others to learn more about their own family stories, and then proudly tell them to their children. I believe this legacy can inform and inspire our future generations. If I could tease out the story behind the story that never got spoken, so can you. There's a phrase that a Vietnam vet used that really captured the inspiration behind my book. He identified the ordinary people that did extraordinary things to make the world ordinary again. I found the answer to my father's silence in the deeds, not words, of the men who fought. I will close with an excerpt that answered my question about the meaning of the faded red book that had sat in our home for so long and that is now part of the permanent collection of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in New York City. I remembered an article I found written by Tony Hayes, the son of a World War II infantry soldier. Tony recounted how his dad had served in most of the major campaigns in Europe and had been with the infantry division that liberated the Dachau concentration camp. Tony's dad had a few stories he told, mainly about war's irony, but Tony was emphatic about one thing. He never talked about Dachau, ever. Tony wrote movingly about a tattered photograph of the skeletal remains of the starved and murdered Dachau inmates that he found in his father's wallet after his death. Why that one of all the pictures he had in his old scrapbooks? Tony wondered. Years later, he visited Dachau and met a veteran and his wife at a restaurant. Tony asked the man if he was at Dachau during the war. The old warrior hesitated for a moment, and then, with tears glistening in the corner of his eyes, he flicked a picture like Tony's dad's on the table. Tony excitedly asked the man, "Why? Why have you carried it for so long? To remind you of the horror of Dachau, of what had been done here?" The man's face carried the faintest of smiles as he shook his head. "No, son. To remind us of the horrors that we are capable of. To remind us not to go down this road again." Tony ended his story with these words, "Dachau is still with us, and I hope the legacy left by our fathers always will be." The Soldiers' War had helped me to realize that individuals who have witnessed or been part of the horrors that we are all capable of only need one reminder. My father had brought one home. His family decided to share it with the world in the hopes that the world would never forget. I feel humbled to finally understand the poignant words of the Combat Infantrymen's Association Memorial. Freedom has a price. The protected will never know. Thank you all very much.